No cities, no rescue, no radio. Just endless ice and temperatures cold enough to freeze a man in minutes. In 1915, 28 explorers were sailing through the deadly waters of Antarctica when their ship suddenly stopped moving. The ice had them. Slowly, silently, the frozen sea began crushing their ship like a giant vice. Soon their vessel would sink, leaving them stranded thousands of miles from civilization. No one expected them to survive. But their leader made a promise. Every man will come home alive. What happened next became one of the most unbelievable survival stories in human history. A journey across drifting ice, a tiny lifeboat sailing 800 miles through the most violent ocean on Earth, and a rescue mission that experts still study more than 100 years later. This is the incredible true story of Ernest Shackleton and the Endurance expedition.
If you enjoy true historical stories and fascinating facts, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who loves history.
In the summer of 1914, an ambitious explorer named Ernest Shackleton prepared for the adventure of his life. His dream was simple in words, but nearly impossible in reality. He wanted to cross the entire continent of Antarctica from coast to coast. At that time, Antarctica was still one of the least understood places on Earth. Vast regions had never been seen by humans, and the environment was brutally unforgiving. Blizzards could appear without warning. Temperatures could drop far below freezing, and the shifting sea ice had the power to destroy ships in minutes. But Shackleton believed his team was ready. He carefully selected 27 men for the expedition. Each man brought a unique skill that might prove vital in the frozen wilderness. There were sailors and navigators, scientists and photographers, carpenters and engineers, and dog handlers who would care for the sled dogs used to travel across the ice. Together they boarded a specially designed ship called the Endurance. The ship had been built with thick wooden beams and a strong hull designed to survive the crushing pressure of Antarctic ice. Loaded with supplies, equipment, and hopeful determination, the expedition left South Georgia Island in December 1914 and sailed toward the icy wilderness. At first, everything seemed promising. The Endurance pushed steadily into the Weddell Sea, weaving through floating slabs of ice. But with every mile south, the ice became thicker. Huge white plates drifted across the ocean, slowly closing the narrow paths between them. Then, one day, in January 1915, the ship stopped moving. Ice had surrounded them on all sides. The crew tried to force the ship forward using the engines, but the frozen sea would not move. They were trapped. At first, the men believed it was only temporary. Surely the ice would break apart in a few days. But days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Instead of breaking free, the Endurance became frozen into the sea itself. The entire ship drifted slowly with the giant ice sheet. Shackleton quickly realized the expedition had changed. They would no longer cross Antarctica. Now their only goal was survival. Life on the trapped ship became a strange routine. The crew cared for their sled dogs and maintained the equipment. They played games on the ice to stay active and keep morale high. Sometimes they even played soccer beside the ship. Shackleton understood something crucial. A hopeless crew could collapse long before the cold killed them. So he made sure the men stayed busy, laughed together, and shared meals as a team. But deep below the frozen surface, powerful currents were slowly shifting the ice. Pressure began building around the ship. The massive ice floes squeezed tighter and tighter. The wooden hull of the Endurance started to groan and crack under the strain.
Then one night in October 1915, the ice finally won. The ship began to break apart. Water rushed inside as the hull split open. Shackleton looked at the wreck and calmly gave the order that changed everything. Abandon ship. The crew quickly gathered supplies, food, tents, and 3 small lifeboats. Then they stepped onto the frozen sea and watched their ship slowly sink beneath the ice. Now they were alone. 28 men standing on a drifting island of ice in the middle of Antarctica. For months they waited. The ice carried them slowly north across a freezing ocean. The men endured violent storms, bitter cold, and the constant fear that the ice beneath them would suddenly break apart. Finally, in April 1916, it did. The giant ice sheet cracked into pieces. The crew had no choice but to launch their lifeboats into the freezing sea. For several terrifying days, they battled enormous waves and icy winds. Their goal was a small rocky land called Elephant Island. When they finally reached the island, the exhausted men collapsed on the shore. It was the first solid ground they had touched in almost 500 days. But there was a terrible problem. Elephant Island was completely remote. No ships passed nearby. If they stayed there, they would slowly starve. Shackleton knew someone had to go for help, but the nearest settlement was more than 800 miles away on South Georgia Island. The journey would cross the most violent ocean on the planet. Still, Shackleton decided to try. He chose 5 volunteers and prepared the strongest lifeboat, the James Caird. The small boat was reinforced with extra wood and canvas to survive the brutal waves. On April 24, 1916, Shackleton and his team sailed away into the storm. For 16 days they battled the Southern Ocean. Giant waves towered above the small boat. Freezing water constantly flooded the deck. Ice formed on the sails and ropes. The men slept only a few minutes at a time. Yet somehow they survived. Finally, after more than 2 weeks at sea, they reached South Georgia Island. But even then, their struggle wasn't finished. They had landed on the wrong side of the island. To reach the whaling stations, they had to cross mountains no one had ever climbed. With almost no equipment, Shackleton and 2 companions began the trek. They climbed icy ridges, crossed glaciers, and stumbled through blinding snowstorms. After 36 hours without sleep, they finally reached a whaling station.
The workers there could hardly believe the story they heard. A ship crushed by ice, men stranded in Antarctica, a tiny boat crossing 800 miles of deadly ocean. But Shackleton had come for help. Several rescue attempts failed because thick sea ice blocked the path. Still, Shackleton refused to give up. Finally, in August 1916, a rescue ship reached Elephant Island. The stranded men looked toward the horizon and saw a ship approaching. When Shackleton stepped onto the beach, the crew rushed forward in disbelief. They had waited 4 months, unsure if anyone would ever return. But their leader had kept his promise. Every single man survived. The Endurance expedition never completed its original mission. They never crossed Antarctica. But their story became something far greater. It became one of the greatest survival and leadership stories in human history. More than a century later, in 2022, explorers even discovered the wreck of the Endurance, resting deep beneath the Antarctic ice, almost perfectly preserved. A frozen reminder of the day a ship was crushed, but the human spirit refused to break. The workers there could hardly believe the story they heard. A ship crushed by ice, men stranded in Antarctica, a tiny boat crossing 800 miles of deadly ocean. But Shackleton had come for help. Several rescue attempts failed because thick sea ice blocked the path. Still, Shackleton refused to give up. Finally, in August 1916, a rescue ship reached Elephant Island. The stranded men looked toward the horizon and saw a ship approaching. When Shackleton stepped onto the beach, the crew rushed forward in disbelief. They had waited 4 months, unsure if anyone would ever return. But their leader had kept his promise. Every single man survived. The Endurance expedition never completed its original mission. They never crossed Antarctica. But their story became something far greater. It became one of the greatest survival and leadership stories in human history. More than a century later, in 2022, explorers even discovered the wreck of the Endurance, resting deep beneath the Antarctic ice, almost perfectly preserved. A frozen reminder of the day a ship was crushed, but the human spirit refused to break.